Bismillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulullah wa alihi wa sahbihi wa azwajihi wa dhurriyyatihi ajma'in. Nationalism, a doctrine which holds that national identity ought to be accorded political recognition. That's why nationalism is modernist ideology or modernist ideology, because before modernity, the idea that national identity, whatever it might be, needs political reality wasn't widespread, even if it existed. Political recognition that nations have rights to autonomy, self-determination, and sovereignty. And that the members of the nation ought to band together in defense of those rights. So nations have an national identity. Nations have a self, and this individual self relates to this self. So we can say maybe, my national self or national identity is my higher self. Or my real self. Is constituted by my national self, or should be. And it's not just a social thing, but it must have a political expression. And the form that political expression takes is autonomy. They're the same thing, self-determination or sovereignty. In this context, they are same things. Why? Because, and the concept which basically defines these concepts is freedom. And freedom from and freedom to. So national self or nation must be free from any external constraint, so that it can be free to do whatever it desires or wants. That's what autonomy is, really. That's what self-determination is. Yourself is determined by from inside, not from outside. And that's what sovereignty is as well. A nation is sovereign when it self-determines itself. Okay. And sovereignty and autonomy and self-determination requires that external constraints, be that ideological, religious, traditional, or even material constraints. For example, scarcity is a constraint. Um, so that's why you need to overcome those constraints. So to overcome those constraints, you need an ideology. Two, and technology. Ideology is nationalism, which tells you that why nations should be sovereign, not God, not tradition, not anything else. Everything should be subservient to nation technology. In order to gain that sovereignty over everything, you need power, you need material resources, you need technology, so you can overcome natural restraint as well. And nation can become whatever it wants to, can do it. So nation become a god. It replaces God. Obviously, there are different form of nationalisms. Uh, but that's the essence of nationalism. Okay. So nationalism can be distinguished from, though it is often in practice indistinct from chauvinism, which makes one's own nationality the overriding moral and political uh, consideration. Well, that's a form of that's the essence. If you want, I mean, if you think that your nation must be autonomous and sovereign, determine itself, then that's the logical conclusion. In reality, obviously, those things are constrained by other ideologies. So you might be a nationalist, but you might be a Muslim as well, or Hindu as well. So then you have to deal with that as well. So that's a practical reality. Or if you are a liberal but nationalist, so your liberalism is going to constrain your nationalism, etc. But when nationalism is the overriding ideology, then what this entry is calling chauvinism is a logical conclusion of that. So the theoretical distinction here runs parallel to the distinction between individualism and egoism. And it can be elucidated in the following way. National rights, like individual rights, are properly reiterated for each newly arriving nation. And the limit of these rights are necessarily fixed by right of nation that comes next. Chauvinism acknowledges no limits except those dictated by national self-interest. I mean, this is to call it chauvinism. Actually, we should just keep it nationalism, because this is what nationalism is. And if there are practical limitations, if the practical limitations are accepted, that's because of other consideration. For example, the nation is not the sole overriding interest. Because we are talking about a concept, in reality things are always mixed. So conceptually speaking, we don't need to make this distinction between chauvinism and nationalism, as well as individualism and egoism. It is entirely possible then to be a liberal nationalist, defending rights of nation other than one's own, and seeking negotiated settlements, compromises, even in disputes involving one's own. But this position is relatively rare in political life, or better, it is a position that seems to erode rapidly whenever the disputed issues touch upon what are taken to be vital national interests. Yeah, that's true, because if your nation is sovereign, if your nation is the ultimate ultimate determining factor of what should be done, then obviously this position is a logical position. Although obviously there are always going to be practical constraints, in the sense that although you want to overcome all constraints, but you never are able to overcome all constraints. But those are practical constraints. Um, as an ideology of identity attaching political significance to the history and culture of an ethnos or people, nationalism is a modern phenomenon. That's true. Because nationalism as a social entity existed before nations, but nation meant a social thing. But in modernity, nationalism is a political ideology. Though it is not without precedent and parallel in the ancient world. Similarly, nations conceive as a group whose members are prospective nationalists or modern creations. That's true as well. What does prospective mean? So, similarly, nations conceived as groups whose members are prospective nationalists, future national, are modern creations, politically fashioned out of diverse social materials. In fact, nations are created through genocide mostly in modern world. Citizenships, religious faith, common language, some defining historical experience. All these in some cases, any one of them in others have played formative part. Not just the actual common language. Common languages were mostly created through destroying other languages. And historical experience, obviously, people didn't have historical experiences which they imagined to be. So all modern nations are imagined communities. Their myths are created in order to justify this modern concept. All in these, obviously, there is always a history, but that history is mythologized and imagined in a way in which it never existed. All these, in some cases, any one of them in others have played a formative role, or in other versions of the story have been exploited by publicists and politicians in shaping national identity. The resulting nationalism differ among themselves, more political and open, more ethnic and exclusive, depending on the achieved shape. As I said, it also depends on the other ideologies which are present and how they interact with other ideologies. But it does not appear that national rights are dependent in a similar way. They must be, like individual rights again, same for all nations that are prepared to recognize their limits. I mean, national rights, if as defined by a nation, is obviously self-determination. All other limitations are basically either they are practical limits, or those limits are imposed because of the presence of other ideologies which are important as well, or considered important. Anyways, subhanakallah wa bihamdika nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Sallu ala sayyidina wa maulana Muhammad wa ala alihi